Positive time reporting. Now, admittedly, this is something you are much more likely to encounter than projects requiring work breakdown structures and timeline charts. I think that's what the other thing was called. This, as I said, probably you will encounter, because time material or labor hour type contracts happen fairly frequently. Maybe not with what you do exactly, but they're much more prevalent than other types. So, for time and material or labor hour types of contracts, and the labor hour contract, as I said before, is simply time and material without the material. It's just time. Positive time reporting should be required in the specifications contract. And we will tell you what positive time reporting means. Also specified should be the unit of time measurement to be used. And most people think, well, if it's time and material, you get paid by the hour. Except vendors frequently want to bill at least on the quarter hour and sometimes on the 10th of an hour, like every 6 minutes. So they get into more increments and get more billing. So if you don't specify, it's a minor area of potential conflict, and usually they're going to say, this is our normal fashion of billing, and if you don't have something that says otherwise, you're probably going to end up doing what they say is their normal routine for billing. So what is meant by the second one is whether the vendor must bill in whole, half, quarter, or 10th of hour increments. So telling them what they should do. Increments of 60 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, or 6 minutes. And this is another thing that I never see, but always when I see time and material type contracts, I always go back to the agency and say, you need to address this, is since it's usually not going to be exact. If it's a quarter hour increment, what if they work 16 minutes? For 16 minutes, what do you do? And the vendor's always going to say, it's over 15, therefore it goes into, I'm billing for a half hour. And if you don't specify otherwise, they might say, that's what we do routinely. There's no question that that's the way we were going to do this. You didn't say otherwise, that's our normal billing procedure. So what I'm telling you is address it. That if it is not exact, whether it's 60, 30, 15, or 6, no matter what it is, whether if it's over that, it's going to be rounded up to the next whole billing increment, or if it's not exact, it's going to be rounded down. Now what that means, of course, is if they are 1 minute over, if it's up, you're going to go up to the next one. If it's down, it's going to go down to the other one. And rounding means that as long as it's not 4 minutes, if it's a 6 minute increment, 10th of a minute, 10th of an hour, that means if they go more than 3 minutes, it's going to be rounded up. If they have 3 minutes, well, if they have less than 3 minutes, it's going to be rounded down. If it's exactly 3 minutes, I guess that would be rounded up. That's like exactly 50%. But you should address this. And it's not going to be major, but it's simply something that can save perhaps money, because if you think every bill that might come in on a major project, for every person, for every time they've worked on it, those couple minutes may end up mounting up. And if you're paying time and material, you're paying them. So just specify. All right, that's the next one, right? Sometimes when this thing jumps, eventually, I was on 15? All right. So this is just the example of the round up, round down. If billing is in 15-minute increments and a contractor employee worked 2 hours and 20 minutes, the billing would be for 2 hours and 30 minutes if time is rounded up, and 2 hours and 15 minutes if time is rounded down. So that just shows you it can make a 15-minute billing difference. If they're billing $100 an hour, 15 minutes is $15. And again, if you have lots of different bills, that could end up to hundreds, if not thousands of dollars just in rounding. And we would rather we save the money than pay it. And if you don't mention it, the vendor's always going to press for rounding up. Okay, contractors, again, going to the issue of positive time reporting and what we are advocating. Contractors shouldn't just submit an invoice for a given number of hours of effort. Instead, any invoice should be accompanied by a copy of a signed time card or other type of detailed payroll record that lists the specific employee of the contractor or subcontractor and the hours they work, and that the summation of all the employees and all the time comes up to what's on the invoice. And let me go to the next slide that will illustrate this. Let's see. Specifically, each contractor, subcontractor, employee that is being used under the contract should keep track of the following whenever they are performing work on the contract: the specific days, specific hours performing contract work. A lot of people think of lawyers. Lawyers bill by they have billable hours. And they supposedly, what I've been told is, the ones in the private sector, what they are told is their first job is to record any time they thought about a client's work, were on the phone, did anything. Because anything they do of actual work or thinking or anything like that is billable hours. And the first standard is they want to get paid. So they record that. We should require that excuse me, of our vendors, that if they're billing for hours, we want to know who the people, what employees worked, when, the number of hours, the days, etc., the nature of the work that they performed, what they were working on. If the contract requires billing different hourly rates for different categories of labor, not just that you worked from 1 to 2 p.m. on our contract, but unless you only are certified or identified as working in one labor category, we want to know what you were doing. Because if we pay different amounts for different categories of work, we want to know what work you were doing, and thus what billable hour time that you would be paid for that work. And I have some illustrations. Category of labor billing. If the contractor's project manager, supposedly the overall highest paid typically person working for the contractor, if for some reason the contract manager spent an hour doing photocopying. Now, photocopying is not contract management activity. This is something that normally would be done by clerical, and maybe there's a billing rate for clerical, or maybe even this is overhead, that there is not a specific rate. So just knowing that the contract manager spent an hour working on the contract isn't sufficient to know whether that person should be paid or what rate that person should be paid. If there's a clerical hourly rate, then the project manager doing photocopying should get paid the clerical hourly rate, not the project manager hourly rate, because that was their inefficiency that accounted for the project manager doing photocopying, not somebody that got paid maybe $30 an hour rather than $150 an hour. And if clerical work is stated in the specifications to be considered part of overhead and not separately billed, the project manager cannot bill for his or her photocopying time. So just because they were doing work does not mean they should be paid for that work. Similarly, if a senior auditor did work designated for a junior auditor, the time should be billed at the junior auditor rate, because that's the work that was done. They are supposed to get the appropriate people doing the appropriate job, and there's times when I have done photocopying, and I just figure I'm doing photocopying that time, not writing contracts. Each contractor, subcontractor, employee doing work on the contract should also identify what results were achieved by the work effort, or what evidence there might there be to substantiate the appropriateness of the claimed hours of work. Examples. If an employee was attending a meeting and they list on this positive time recording that on, what is today, December 2nd, from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., attended a training session at the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and they're billing for the time for attending a training session that supposedly is something that's integral to doing the contract work. There should be some kind of sign-in sheet from the meeting that indicates that person was actually there from 2 to 4 on December 2nd, so that some kind of at least nominal verification that the person did what they claimed they were doing. It could be the minutes of the meeting, noting the starting and ending time, and the fact that that person was among the attendees. Or if the employee was performing work on state premises, there might be a sign-in, sign-out procedure whereby a state employee verifies the time on site. Many years ago, when I was involved with photocopiers here at DHMH, whenever a repair person came on site, the standard procedure was when they came on site, they had to go to a state employee and who had to note their arrival time, and then they would do their work to fix the photocopier, because this was billable. If it wasn't a flat maintenance contract, there were times when they got paid for the hourly maintenance work. So they had to sign in when the person got there, and when the person left, they had to get a state employee to sign when they left, and then that was turned in so that if they billed for that maintenance visit, first of all, we had verification that, number one, a phone call was even made requesting maintenance. So that was one thing. We had a procedure whereby only certain people were authorized to call for maintenance. So then they kept track of it. Number one was a call placed for maintenance. So even if someone signed in and signed out, if no one called for maintenance because supposedly there was no problem, we wouldn't pay. If they came for routine maintenance, we wouldn't pay for routine maintenance. We only pay for other types. So that's what you go at. So if they're on site, sign in, sign out by a state employee. For conference calls, lengthy phone calls to a state employee, there would be phone records noting the number called, the call duration. So if they're on the phone with me for half hour, I should be able to verify that I spent that duration of a call with so-and-so, especially if I did my contractor contact list that we said before, where we're noting each instance where there's a call made, the duration, the person talked to, the subject matter, etc. That's something that's available to check against. Required information described in the 6 previous slides generally is not conclusive proof that a contractor employee was fully engaged in contract work for the described time period or was productively engaged versus talking around the water cooler. I'm not going to tell you if you require them to give you a time form that says they worked from this time to that time. It's going to prove, number one, that they did, or number two, that they did anything worthwhile. Because talking about the water cooler, how many times have we, all of us, at work, there are various times during the day when we're talking to our next door neighbor, we're walking down the hall and someone else we see and we say, hi, how's the family? Where'd you go on your vacation? Well, we don't want to pay for that, but if they say they worked a given amount of time on our contract, we don't know how much of it was serious effort versus, well, I spent 10 minutes talking to my next door neighbor and I got to put that down as being billed to somebody, so guess what, state, you're it. But at least it's more than if we ask for nothing. If the alternative to asking for information like this is just tell me how many hours you devoted, 130, pay 130, and that's all we ask for, there's a whole lot more ability to verify. The more you ask for, the more ability you have to check something than if you ask for nothing. So, and we're going to keep talking about more of these instances. This type of information is far better than simply accepting whatever a contractor lists on an invoice, and most vendors, and I'm saying this and I believe this, most vendors will not deliberately lie about specific employees' work times or work activities. It's a lot easier for a vendor to say 130 hours than Tom spent 10 hours, Mary spent 12 hours, Alice spent 20 hours on these days at these times doing this work. You have to fabricate a whole lot more if you're coming with specific people, specific times, specific activities than just 130 hours. Which is what this says. It's one thing to submit an invoice for 130 hours, it's another thing to say this person for this much, specific times, specific activities, etc. Betsy Roth, Martha Lewis, Washington. I've heard of those people. With a bill for just 130 hours, there is little, and that's just an illustration, there is little, if anything, that can be checked to validate the accuracy of the bill with detailed breakdown by employee. For instance, if you're the contract manager for the state, and if you've kept your log, you might know that you made a call to a specific employee of the vendor on a specific day, and he's on vacation, or he was out in a meeting the whole day, and you noted that you made a phone call and couldn't get the person because they were out. And then if you get the bill, and the bill says that same person was there in the office working for X hours on your contract when you have listed that they were on vacation, you have the ability and you will have the responsibility to say, wait a minute, how can that person be working my contract when they're on vacation? And of course the vendor can come back and say, well, it was a working vacation and they were working on your activity. But again, they have to say something positive and make a statement that that is the case. You at least have some ability to question it because you have something that you can at least check with to see whether everything seems to be okay with what they're submitting. Out of the office reply, or if several employees attended the same meeting from the contractor. It could be questioned why one is at the meeting from 2 to 4 when the other two are at the meeting from 2 to 3. Was it appropriate that the meeting actually went to 4 o'clock and one person had to stay for the full duration and the other two didn't? Or did the meeting end at 3 o'clock and someone just added a little padding to the bill? You would go back and you would do an inquiry if you have something that you can at least check against. If the specifications contract requires the contract to include, and this is another level, and this is an even more likely issue where you're not going to get fraudulent billing. If you require that each of the employees listed on the invoice as doing the work for a given time, for a given purpose, needs to sign and have a signed affidavit, so to speak, that yes, they did work on the state contract on these different days, at these different times, and did this work, and I'm signing my name, there's far less likelihood that every employee of the vendor is going to deliberately fabricate their times and sign an affidavit, so to speak, that they worked when they didn't. So that's another level of possible validation. Again, not proving absolutely, but you get more and more involved as far as falsification, the more they assert they did things and they didn't. And if at any time in the future it is proven that they did submit falsified records, then there's more of an issue when they actually made a positive statement of some nature than if they just sent this bill in for 130 hours. Detailed reporting requirements are more likely to result in appropriate billing than minimal or non-existent reporting requirements. Other things to check. So that is positive time recording. And you're not going to do that for every single contract. Number one, it's got to be time and material or time in some fashion. And then you have to determine whether what you're looking for is big enough to merit doing this, whether there's enough information you can glean, whether the contract's long enough to make it worthwhile. As I said, for everything, you have to decide when any of these techniques are appropriate and to what degree they're appropriate. Other things to check relative to time recording. If the vendor did a work plan and identified personnel to be used for various activities, were the persons described on the invoice included in the work plan? So if you go with this work breakdown structure, and they have to identify resources. No resources are specific people. So what people are going to do what activities? So if you have that at the beginning of the contract, what this work breakdown structure is with the people involved, then you get an invoice. And the invoice says a specific person did a specific activity. All you have to do is look at your work breakdown structure to see, was this person identified as doing that activity? If it's not the same person, then you would naturally go back to the vendor and say, did you replace Tom with Dick or Harry? You know, because the one is listed on the work breakdown structure and this is who's on the bill. Versus, well, They either didn't do the work, they're falsifying, just what is the situation. There's something else that you can try to trip up the vendor. And one thing that I have observed over the years, and this was way before I started working in procurement, actually my first job in the state was what was called a quality control reviewer for the Department of Human Resources, where we would do investigation of, I specifically did medical assistance audits of people on medical assistance. And what I found, and I kind of discovered this accidentally, was before we would go and contact a person on medical assistance, I would read the case file, because that's what we were required to do, read the case file. And I would note things on paper of things that I thought were significant that were directly from the case file. And then I would go meet with the medical assistance recipient, and I would ask questions. And I wouldn't say what was in the case file, I would ask questions. And if a person would tell me things that were consistent with the case file, then everything's fine. But when they told me something that wasn't consistent with the information in the case file, what I would say is, well, that isn't what I read in the case file. Can you explain why there's something different between what you just told me and what the case file says? And frequently, the person would start getting a little uneasy. And, oh, that's in the case file? Yes, that's the information in the case file. And they'd kind of almost like, well, what else is in the case file? Because at this point in time, I don't know what I either said to you before, or I don't know what you found out for some other reason. And I actually had, I guess, better than average success, if that's the correct word, of having people admit that they had either income or assets or something that they had not reported, because once I started down the track of, and I don't know if tripping up is the correct word, but I would ask them a question, they'd give an answer, I would say that's not consistent with the record, and then they would either try and explain, and sometimes their explanation is fine. It was a valid explanation that showed that something had happened that maybe not was recorded, or sometimes they just start tripping over everything they said. And I can remember one time when I had someone that just almost in tears said, okay, I admit, I took my mother's money, I transferred it to my account. Yes, we were guilty about the $25,000 we took, and I know we shouldn't have paid it to the state. And I'm like, okay. All because they didn't know what we had. So that's the point here. The more information, the more you simply ask them to verify, the more likely, if they are in some way fabricating, they're either going to trip over, there's different stories, or at some point they might just come out and say, okay, we did hedge a little bit on some of this and maybe pad it, so let me go back and readjust the bill or something. All right, going to the issue of looking at the work plan and who is listed to do work versus who is on the invoice. If everything's fine, that's good, but if it's not the same person, one of the things they might say is, oh, well, yes, on the work plan we listed that so-and-so was going to do it, but instead we're now having this other person do it that we submitted the bill for. Now, if we have a requirement in our specifications that the state has to approve any substitution of key personnel, and we're not aware that they were replacing person A with person B, the first thing we say is, you didn't get authorization to use that person rather than the one listed in the contract or the proposal to begin with. So, payment should be, if it's a substitute but not an approved one, payment should be refused if the substitute was disapproved. If you actually said, no, you cannot use that person because they don't have the necessary qualifications, and they still go ahead and use the person anyway and submit a bill, you don't pay for it. That's what that contract requirement says. Approved substitution, you submit the request, we disapprove it, you can't substitute. And if you use them anyway, we don't pay. That's the first thing. If they had never submitted the person for approval to substitute, then what you probably should do is not pay until they actually submit a request for substitution. And if you're okay and approve the substitution, then you go ahead and pay the bill. But in the meantime, you've held up their payment, which you've sent a message to them, you're not getting your money, which they always want their money, and if you end up disapproving, you're not going to pay. And you do it unless and until the substitution is submitted and approved. So just other things to get through positive time recording that you wouldn't get for, here's a bill. If the person included on the invoice was an ancillary worker who was not required to be in the work plan, it's someone who does some home office support that you knew there were going to be some degree of indirect, and so the person wasn't listed, then what you need to ask and need to have as much as possible provided is, was he or she performing an activity that was listed as being done by another person on the work plan? So if it's ancillary, is it for a work that was in the work plan? So are they replacing someone? Are they billing for something that shouldn't be billed? Just what are the circumstances? If not, it's probably, if they weren't substituting for someone else, it's probably okay to pay the bill for that activity. If so, a change in work plan should be probably done and approved by the agency before payment is authorized for the person's activity. So again, ways to validate and keep everything current and make sure that you're only paying for what you should pay as much as possible. Still on other things to check, compare invoices for work performed against the work plan for that work. From another aspect, if the work plan, if they bill for 200 hours for a given activity, and you go to the work breakdown structure, which says 120 hours should be what is expected to be devoted for this activity, then you would naturally go back to the vendor and say, why you bill me 200 hours for something that you expected to take 120 hours? And then that comes back to, was the one just an estimate or was the one a commitment? If it was an estimate, then they have to somehow convince you that even though they estimated 120 hours, 200 was appropriate for what they did. If that was somehow a firm statement that 120 hours is all it will take, you don't pay for 200 hours of something they said will only take 120 if it was a firm commitment. In this situation, an effort should be made to ascertain if the projected level of effort was underestimated versus the billing being inflated, and of course if it's inflated, you don't pay for the excess. The reason to be particular about whether a vendor employee has been approved to work under the contract or on a given activity is to demand contract requirement compliance. This thing I say over and over and over. In other words, to retain control of the vendor's contract performance. If the contract says they're supposed to get certain approvals and you let them go without getting those approvals, you're sending the message that they can get away with things. And if you get your foot in the door with getting away for things, then the natural tendency is, well, I got away with this one, can I get away with another one? So you need to let them know that you're aware of them doing it and you don't approve of them doing it, and they won't get paid for doing it and they won't be allowed to do it again, etc. In other words, last bullet, if the vendor disregards requirements to get agency approval for personnel substitutes or work activities and still gets paid, the message is that the specifications don't matter. If the contract at issue involves a change management committee, so this is another way of looking at what kind of approvals might the contractor have to do before they can submit a bill for something. Change management, we've talked about the activity where it's not known absolutely in advance what the contractor has to do. It has to kind of be fleshed out as they go along, and there's supposed to be a procedure for approval of what the contractor is going to do each time as a next step. So if the contractor submits a bill, and with the bill they identify personnel and they identify what those personnel were doing. If it is determined by comparing that against the change management procedure that they were not approved to do that activity, then it's the same thing as if they're using personnel that weren't approved. You either, if the work was performed in activities that were rejected, in other words, the vendor said they thought they should do it and we rejected it, we don't pay them. For any work done on an activity, the change management committee or whoever was appropriate rejected, you don't pay. If they never submitted it for approval for something they were required to, then it's the same thing. You refuse to pay for it, or you refuse to pay for it until they submit it to the appropriate change management committee, get approval to do it. If they don't get approval to do it, they don't get paid for the activity that wasn't approved to be done, which you don't know if you don't get this additional information. For persons not identified in the proposal or work plan as dedicated to the contract, dedicated meaning full-time, and or listed on an invoice as devoting less than a full work week to the contract, 10 hours, 12 hours, etc. The vendor might, again, this is just another consideration, be required to state the other activities that the person worked on besides the state contracted issue, the time spent on each, and perhaps a contact person to seek verification. So if I don't know that you're working on my contract full-time and you list someone that worked for 15 hours, depending upon my specifications, I might say, along with the statement that they worked 15 hours on my contract, under the assumption they worked 40 hours in a week, tell me what other activities this person worked on for the balance of the 40 hours so I can see what is said. And if it's another contract or something like that, if I ask for the contact person, if I want to, I might call that other contractor or whoever it is and ask, did person so-and-so work on your contract for 20 hours? And this can be if you start getting suspicious of a vendor's billing and their activities, which sometimes can happen. The purpose of this information is to try to see if the same persons are being billed as simultaneously working for multiple customers. And I can remember a very specific circumstance, again, when I was back here, and I was reviewing a whole lot of contracts for, I think in that case, Developmental Disabilities Administration with a bunch of vendors, the nonprofit organizations, and they were required to have their detailed line item budgets, and in many cases they had to list the specific individuals to be employed under the contract and the anticipated number of hours per week to work under the contract. And because most of the contracts were on a fiscal year basis, they were all coming in at the same time, and because I am this type of person that doesn't just sign things, but I read them, so I would read one contract for a given organization. A given organization might have two contracts with DDA, one with mental hygiene, one with alcohol and drug abuse, whatever. And so I'm reading the contracts, and I'll read the ones for DDA for a given vendor, and I will note that certain people are working 40 hours a week under the DDA contract. And then I move on, and I start with mental hygiene, and it's like, wait a minute, didn't I just see that person listed under the DDA, Developmental Disabilities contract? So I go back and get that and open up and say, yes, that person was going to work 40 hours under the contract that this vendor has for developmental disabilities. And now the person is also working 40 hours under the contract for mental hygiene administration. Now, is this person going to routinely commit to work 80 hours every week? Or do we have some issue here of that the vendor is listing the same people and is basically going to get paid for that same person under two different contracts, and probably basically get double paid for the person for some percentage of time because they're getting paid under two contracts? So that's the thing I have remembered, obviously, for about 20 years now, and I found more than one instance. And once I found one, not even looking for it, but just circumstance was, it was fresh in my mind from reading one and going to the next, then I went back and started specifically looking for it and picked up a couple other instances. And that's just in the ones that were actually listed by name. So the more information you have, the more ability you have to catch these kind of things. No comment?
I want to know the outcome. What did the vendor say?
Well, the agency went back to the mental hygiene, DDA went back to the vendor, and I think in most instances what they did was simply change the identity of the person and say, oh, did I list that person under both contracts? Plus, the other thing that happens for development, for the human service agencies, is they tend to overlook most things from their vendors. They explain them away. But anyway, at least I noted, and something was changed, because I wouldn't sign the contract with that same person being identified to work 40 hours when they already were identified. So either they changed the person or went back and adjusted both contracts or something. Now, whether they did it is another question. But at least when they were signed, it was not there apparent of something that did not seem like it was going to take place. And I don't think any of them came back and said, yep, going to work 80 hours a week. For this purpose, agencies could also take these actions. If the vendor had, going back to things you can do to check, and some of these you may simply have reserved the right in the contract if you find circumstances of apparent abuse. And then the fact you reserve the right to do these, if you do observe this apparent abuse of billing, then you might actually start invoking these to actually do the checking, like I said I did in this other instance. Once I found one, I started looking for that specific circumstance again. If the vendor had multiple contracts with the same agency, which is what was the case here, multiple with DHMH, not necessarily multiple with developmental disabilities, but if you have one with developmental disabilities and one with mental hygiene, they're still coming through me, I'm looking at them. Vendor had multiple contracts with the agency, check the billing on the other contract or contracts. If there were other state agencies that had contracts, in AdPix you can find out if the vendor has, by doing their vendor code, vendor registration code, or whatever that name is, you can find out if they have other state contracts, and you could potentially check with the other agency and see whether a given person is being billed to them as working at the same time they're being billed to you. From references or other information in a proposal identifying other projects vendor employees worked under the contract or engaged in. So if you know from their references in the proposal that they were working on another activity, another vendor, you might find out who that vendor is, who the customer is, and try to validate this information. And you would typically only do this if you have reason to really suspect that they are fraudulently or improperly billing, negligently. From many of the sources listed on the prior slides, the agency could try to learn if among multiple customers the same employee is collectively being submitted on bills for more than 40 hours per week, especially if the total billing is far beyond 40 hours. Although, particularly in the private sector, it is possible for a given employee to work more than 40 hours in a week. Whenever this fact is discovered, the vendor should be required to validate all hours were actually worked for the employee, by the employee. Typically, an agency wouldn't resort to many of the validation activities listed on the prior slides, and it should be considered that all of the effort that vendor employees exert to document proper billing is billable. If it's time and material, and this is a consideration, all the information that they have to do to validate the accuracy of their bills is time spent under the contract and is billable in and of itself. So these are considerations. Now I'm going to go in a slightly different direction, I think. And this I am. However, if while performing more routine checking of invoices, it is discovered that a vendor is overbilling for the time of any employee, one or more of the prior described actions and/or actions on the next slides might be employed from then on, or at least until the agency is convinced the overbilling will not recur. So a lot of these things you probably will not do routinely from day one of the contract. But what you might do is have them as possible actions under the contract to be triggered if you determine instances of either improper billing, fraudulent billing, etc. And then you might go back and have it written that any of those prior activities will occur, or any of the ones I'm going to get to next, with the caveat that they may not bill for any work on these activities that are prompted because they were documented as doing fraudulent billing. That way you might be able to have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. Have the validation and not have to pay for it. And the specifications might specifically say what I just said, that extra time spent by the vendor personnel to prove proper billings is not billable if the requirement for the extra effort is triggered by the discovery of improper billing, although it might be hard for an agency to determine what efforts might fall within this prohibition. If only for symbolism, the prohibition should be stated. You can't bill if your activities are to give us a comfort level because we already tripped you up on improper billing before. So aside from the ones that we have already talked about, which you can go back and review and see if those might be anything you want to write as a contingency basis, you have other things you might write. For instance, you might have something that says if we find 2 or 3 instances of improper billing, that we're going to, the contract will automatically be switched or certain parts switched from time and materials to fixed price, so that we're not going to get in this situation anymore of trying to validate whether the time that you submit is proper. We'll just work out a fixed price and that'll be it. If it is certain the fixed price would be no more than what was anticipated to be paid for these activities. A vendor might have some difficulty agreeing to this, but your leverage is, I've already uncovered 1, 2, 3 instances of improper billing. You're on thin ice at this point in time. I can't trust you. I don't know whether you're billing me anything properly, and this might be a little overstating. And so I would have a much better comfort level, and I would be much more inclined not to start thinking about termination for default if you agreed to modify this to be fixed price rather than continuing with me trying to validate all these hourly rates and effort and things of that nature. So maybe with a threat of termination, a vendor might agree to this, as long as we have a pretty good comfort level that that fixed price is going to be less than what we expected to pay, not more than, by any means, not more than. Can establish a maximum cap on the total billing, so not fixed, but we'll pay time and material up to that cap, and if they keep billing beyond that, if they supposedly keep working beyond that, fine and dandy. They're not going to get paid any more money on the hourly basis. They will get paid on an hourly basis up to the cap, no more. So even if it wasn't that way to begin with, through those circumstances, we might negotiate this circumstance rather than simply a fixed price. Or we could add retainage, we could increase retainage, something of that nature for future invoices. These are all possible actions triggered by 1 or more instances of improper billing. We could require the person and perhaps others at the end of each workday. This is really getting extreme. But if you, the vendor, say you have 3 people working on my contract, instead of waiting to the end of the month to get some kind of documentation about the hours that those people worked on my contract, you could have them each day at the end of the day, in the last 5 or 10 minutes, send an email to the state contract manager saying, today, here's the hours I spent on your contract, here's what I did. So that this is being aggregated on a day-to-day basis, not just internally within the vendor, but with the state agency as well. Now, obviously, it's more work for the state contract manager, but in this instance, if you have documented some improper billing, it might be the prudent thing to do. And we might also require a daily supervisor of the vendor sign off of the accuracy of the person's daily work report. So not just do we get it from each of the people working, but their supervisor has to also sign. The more people that have to sign something, the more people will be very reticent about signing something that isn't true. They'll get nervous and they'll say, I'm not going to sign something unless I know it's correct. And so either they'll submit things that are correct or you won't get it signed, in which case you have the right to question and perhaps not pay. If the detected overbilling is severe, it should be considered whether termination for default is appropriate and possible referral to the Office of the Attorney General for criminal investigation and or debarment consideration. And that is the last of that, which you're all saying, thank goodness, it's about time. Any question on any of these things? You have to decide if any of them are appropriate or under what circumstances for what contract. Just, they're there for a reference for you to know what the possibilities are. Now I'm going to mention debarment. And a lot of people, including me sometimes, debarment, disbarment. One applies to contractors relative to government contracting. One applies to lawyers in terms of being not allowed to practice as lawyers anymore. Disbarment applies to lawyers. Debarment applies to contractors. And it's easy to slip from D to dis. Ask me about it. Okay, but it's not easy to go from one side to the other. Debarment. Debarment is an action initiated by the Office of the Attorney General that in Maryland must be approved by the Board of Public Works. For any vendor to be debarred, the Office of the Attorney General has to have done an investigation, have determined that there was fraudulent impropriety, not negligence or something like that, but actually deliberate action. I think didn't I talk about the Carter Center trash removal on the second day? Where the vendor, and in fact I mentioned that the company was not debarred because the company, the headquarters of the company was not aware that the fraudulent billing was occurring. When they found out, they fired everybody, which they didn't have to since they went to jail. But they fired everybody and basically cleaned house and replaced all new management, so the vendor was not debarred. Debarment comes about when there's fraudulent activities with an intent to get money for things that are not earned and is a deliberate, concentrated action to do that. Let's see, debarment means a vendor and or specific employees, officers, or stockholders are prohibited from receiving a state of Maryland or local government, a state or Maryland local government contract. Because in Maryland, if you are debarred, you can't get a state contract and you can't get a contract with any of the local governments in Maryland. Okay, that's the state law, applies to both. Either for a specific duration or indefinitely. So a lot of debarments are for 5-year periods, some are indefinite, which means at some point you can come back and ask to be reinstated if you want to. If it's a 5-year, then you're debarred for 5 years, etc. Debarments are also done by the federal government or other governments throughout the nation. I mean, this is kind of like a standard activity, but it only happens because it has been proven that there has been fraudulent, and probably not just one, but a succession of fraudulent actions of usually a substantial nature that a vendor cannot be trusted, so they're prohibited from working for governments. And in Maryland, one of the things you're supposed to do is any vendor, before you determine they're responsible, you check to see if they're debarred. And if they're debarred by anybody, if they're debarred by the federal government, if they're debarred by California, we cannot use them. And I think I talked more about debarment. Yes? What? Did I go back, forward?
The requirement to check for debarment is in Maryland and on the federal list. So you might find out that they were debarred in California, but we don't search California debarments. We search Maryland and federal.
Yes. And there is,
I think they had to go to 4,900.
but if you want to, feel free. The Board of Public Works has an advisory on debarment, so the initial recommendation is you go to the Board of Public Works website and look on the debarment list, and all the vendors that have been debarred in Maryland are on the list of the Board of Public Works, and whether it's for a given duration, whether it's for indefinite, it's identified. And I don't know whether they list all the feds or they just have a link. I think there's just a link to the federal debarment. And again, if you're debarred, no matter where you're debarred, you cannot have a contract in Maryland. So that's something you're supposed to be doing before you seek to award to any contractor. Because this means they're bad people. Okay, time and material considerations. Typically, and this is, I think, more for material than for time at this point. Typically, it is required for contractors performing time and material type contracts to bill the state for materials at actual cost. If time and materials, that means you can bill for hours and you can bill for other things aside from hours that went into you performing the state contract. And the one example we're going to talk about either later today or on the fourth day, the vital records, that does involve software, and that is a material type thing, although that was not a time material type contract. At least that's an illustration. But what we generally recommend is if you have a time material type contract, you put in your specifications that the vendor must bill materials at cost, i.e. they cannot make a profit on materials. And we generally do that because otherwise we don't know what the vendor is going to do in terms of markup and things of that nature. If we're going to, in so many words, reimburse you for cost, then we want you to, that cost to be the cost you paid for another entity to provide it to you, because I've been in situations where the vendor has said their cost is not just what they paid another entity, but all their indirect costs that they normally add to anything where they have, let's say, a 50% markup of direct costs and things like that. And I've gone down the road with vendor to say, no, cost is only cost, not in addition to your markup, etc. And so it's best to identify this in the specifications. If this is the case,
Can I take an opposite?
Take an opposite view.
Yeah. We've done some contracts where we have allowed the vendor to make a profit on parts. The rationale is that we want the vendor to buy the parts at the lowest possible price. And vendors can oftentimes buy things less expensively than we can. And by recognizing that a component of their profit is 10%, if we agree to something like 10% over their actual material cost, there could be a case made that this is motivation for the vendor. Actually, I guess you can make it either way, that he'll seek the higher price or the lower price. But we've often had the case where if we don't provide some motivation, he calls up his three buddies and he gets his lowest price, which is higher than what he could have bought it for. And we're still, I mean, that doesn't solve the problem, but it seems to be a little bit more motivating, where we're up front with the vendor, we'll allow you to make a profit. Where things get a bit dicey is things like pharmaceuticals, which I still can't understand. Because even though we may pay at a certain percentage over cost in that business, we don't have time to discuss cost in that business, but it's
no one knows about cost in that business.
Yeah, right. So it's a very complicated process. But there's no prohibition against negotiating. If you're into a negotiating posture, or if you are doing a bid where you say something that a certain profit would be allowed on parts. Just my opposite.
Well, it's not an opposite, because if you read this, it says typically. That does not mean it cannot ever be done. This is a general guideline, but if there's a circumstance where you think, and usually your thinking will be guided by vendors coming back and complaining before the submission date, and it kind of depends upon the magnitude of the work that they have to go into to get the materials. If they're very incidental, you probably would say no markup. If they have to do a great amount of effort to get these materials that are going to be paid at cost, then maybe you want to give them some amount of money for the effort, especially if they don't have any other way to pay for it. There's no question that if a vendor has to go through work to identify suppliers and to pick the best suppliers, etc., we may benefit by their more aggressive activities to get lower priced vendors. So maybe it's appropriate. But you have to use your magical crystal ball to try to figure out, in any given instance, is that appropriate versus is it not? The other thing I will throw out, and I will throw this out simply because it has been said to me at one time by the principal counsel of my department, there is a prohibition in Title 21 about what are called cost plus percentage of cost contracts. Now, paying time and materials with materials being at a percentage of cost, I have heard both ways. I have heard the general guidance is that a component of a contract, which is cost plus a percentage of cost, does not trigger the prohibition of cost plus the percentage of cost. But I've also, at one point, been told by my principal counsel, who is no longer the principal counsel, that the prohibition even drills down to components of contracts. There can be no component of a contract which is cost plus the percentage of cost. And if it was cost plus 10%, then depending upon the interpretation, that might be prohibited. And one way we got around this, when we thought it was appropriate, we didn't make it cost plus a percentage of cost. We either had a fixed fee for work, or we said if materials were from $1 to 10,000, we will pay you a set fee for those purchases. If it's 10,000 to 20,000, we'll have another fee. So it wasn't an exact percentage plus percentage, or cost plus a percentage. So considerations. And believe me, when the person was our principal counsel, we followed that dictate.
And I see, I would have thought that would have been the standard boilerplate, because our spec does say material cost plus, I think, 5 or 10%, and I thought that was boilerplate.
It is for small procurements that we do. And we've yet to have an AAG problem.
And small procurements, I'm not going there. I'm not worried about it. Let's see. So typically, our typical recommendation is that you have them provide materials at cost on the premise that generally this is not a terribly significant aspect and they can include it in overhead. But if it is a very significant component, then maybe you do some other mechanism to allow them to make some money on that activity. Let's see, if you do have the prohibition about any markup, then when the vendor submits the bill for materials, they need to provide copies of the invoices from the material supplier to prove there's been no markup, or even if you do allow a markup, you still need the actual invoice to show what the cost was to the vendor, so you know what then of a markup that is allowed, either percentage-wise or fixed fee-wise or whatever. So you're getting, again, some other validation for whatever is being billed to you. Often it is required for contractors to obtain competitive quotes from 3 or more suppliers before deciding which supplier to use, which would be in the specifications. Not mandatory, but it's something you might consider to be an appropriate requirement, with the selected supplier being the one with the lowest price. But as Gary has said, they can play games. And I've had it myself for state agencies where they would contact vendors when they would have to get 3 bids. They would know who their highest priced vendors were, so they would always call the 2 highest priced. They knew they were going to get prices out of the ballpark with those 2 vendors, and then the third one was always the one they wanted to award to. So there are ways, and we catch on to some of these every now and then.
Gee, I never knew that. That's
Never
a
knew
good
that.
idea.
Didn't plant any ideas in your mind, don't remember that. But even if you require this, then there's still potential for some games, but at least you're saying something that they can't just go to one vendor and pay whatever price to that one vendor. And this is when you have materials that you are reimbursing in some fashion, that this is a consideration. If this is the case, when vendors submit bills for materials, they need to provide copies of the competitive quotes to show the lowest priced vendor supplier was chosen, as well as the invoices from this supplier to prove there have been no markup. So again, validating the bills that are submitted. Continuing, if there is leeway for a contractor to select among, other than the lowest bidder among multiple providers, or not attempting competition in sole source circumstances, the rationale for such circumstances needs to be provided along with all other required documentation. What this says is maybe you do not have an absolute requirement that they have to go to 3 bidders, but if they don't go to 3 bidders, they have to come in with a rationale, and you have to approve that rationale before you'll reimburse them only getting it from 1 supplier. So that's what that says. Or if you have a sole source, then to where we haven't done specifications typically, like we do for competitive circumstances, that's something you'll try to negotiate with your vendor, your sole source provider, and maybe they don't want to go to the 3, but you work out at least if they don't, you need to approve the one they go to if you're paying for the materials. And I'm going to continue to talk about it. So let's see. If specifications permit a vendor to add a fixed fee, so there I go. Sometimes I should read these things before I start talking. To add a fixed fee to the purchased material, which is not the preferred situation, verify that the fee added to the actual materials cost is the fee that is permitted, in addition to verifying materials are billed at actual cost. And it must be verified that a vendor is not paid its actual cost for materials plus a percentage of cost, since this practice is prohibited by 21060301. So I guess I kept what my attorney said at the one time. Hey, I'm just putting, you can go to your attorney. You'll probably get a different legal opinion than I got at that time.
I don't want to ask.
Don't ask, don't tell. Whatever. Now I guess we're off time material, but we're back on measuring progress conclusion. Oh, conclusion. We're going to get done with it. The difficulty in trying to determine when it is appropriate to pay for work under time materials or labor hour contracts illustrates why these are the least preferred methods for state contracting. And they are. The time materials, you're supposed to have, the preference is for fixed price or fixed unit price over time and materials or labor hours or cost reimbursement, that type of thing. But there are situations when using these types of contracts, it's the best course of action. A fuller explanation of when and how to use these types of contracts is presented in the planning class and the pricing, billing, and contract type class. Planning is a 6-day class and pricing is a 4-day class, which is not finalized yet. We did a pilot of 3 days.
Under construction, right?
Yeah, it's close. We did 3 days. 3 days wasn't adequate. It's going to go to 4 days. Have to do some revision, but I haven't had a chance to revise it now in 11 months. So someday it'll happen.
You're on schedule.
On schedule. Okay, any questions about billing and validating when it's not obvious what you're supposed to be paying for? And I bet none of you have the least inclination to ask a question. Anyone have the audacity to incur the wrath of their fellow? Move on, huh? Price adjustments. This is something that frequently does occur in specifications and something you should consider for long-term contracts based upon the volatility of what it is you're contracting for. If a solicitation contract permits adjustments to the contractor's price according to pre-identified factors, and it must be pre-identified, it must be clear when such adjustment is permitted. I would say over and over and over, not just saying what, but when. If the adjustment results in contractor, if the adjustment results in contractor price increases. When the adjustment, if the adjustment is going up, we have to tell them when they were allowed to do it. So there can be circumstances, if we say only at the start of the second year of the contract can you get an adjustment, then for the first year you don't want them to submit anything that says, oh, the CPI has gone up by 8%. Well, I guess now it's about 0.5%. So we need a cost adjustment. If it's the second year of the contract, there's no adjustment in the first year. So when? When to impose the adjustment. difference between permit and impose. When you talk about an adjustment, you should specifically say that the adjustment could be up or down. Typically, and typically is probably 98% of the time anymore, adjustments only go in one direction, up. But every now and then there are price decreases. And just like we are allowing the vendor to be protected from price increases, if for any reason there's a price decrease, we should take advantage of the decrease. And a lot of specifications, when they talk about adjustment, they only talk about increases. And I have experienced in my 30 years a couple instances when there have been decreases, and if the specs didn't say it, the vendor's saying, no, there's no adjustment if it goes down, so you just gave me some more money because it went down. Whereas the answer that should be is write it in your specs to begin with that the adjustment will be up or down depending upon the described circumstance. If the CPI goes down, we pay less. If it goes up, we pay more. The contractor is not likely to remind the agency that his prices should be reduced. They're going to come to you whenever they say they're entitled to an increase. And I've had circumstances where they came to me before they were entitled to an increase and tried to get it to be paid. But I've never had anyone that said, oh, by the way, you forgot to subtract money from me. Maybe you have.
Never.
I know Gary has.
Only in labor.
I was being facetious, but apparently.
I wanted to say this comment when we were back on the labor situation, and maybe it's appropriate here, I don't know. In my earlier days, I owned a trucking company and had all Teamster employees. One of the things that the AFL-CIO does recognize is that the theft of time is
Teamsters aren't in AFL-CIO, are they?
Yeah, they are.
Maybe they are now. I don't know. All right.
The theft of time is a dismissible offense. You catch somebody stealing time, don't bother.
You mean inflating their timesheets? What do you mean stealing time?
Yeah,
Inflating
their
timesheets,
time
okay.
sheets. And these would be drivers or warehouse employees or somebody like that. So sometimes what I would do when I was bored and I was doing timesheets to summarize their weekly time payments would be to add hours to the time. And of course, nobody ever said anything when you added 5 hours in a given week.
You mean just to see if they'd come back and say they got overpaid?
Yeah. So I would take it away the next week, and hey, boss, you shorted me 5 hours of time. I added it last week. Let's sit down and talk about this. So
Well, they thought you were just giving them a incentive bonus.
I never did it around holiday seasons.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was just an anecdote that I thought I'd mention. I don't know how appropriate it is here, but people will not, as you can imagine, tell you when you're nice to them. They'll only complain when you're not, normally.
Normally, yes. Okay. Aside from when a price adjustment may or must occur, the actual amount of the adjustment must be verified. Usually the adjustment wording in the solicitation contract states that the contractor must provide documentation to support the amount of the adjustment. If this is done, this documentation must be reviewed to see if it is accurate in terms of the adjustment factor being used in the actual calculation. And I will tell you that we have a contract, we have something submitted to us by another agency, not represented in this room by any individual, that has come to us twice where they want to give the vendor, I don't know, tens of thousands of dollars for a very major contract, a contract that's around $55 million in nature. And they want to give them an adjustment due to the change in the CPI. And because we're DBM and because this is just what we do, we went and we looked at the contract before we approved this, and we said, but there's nothing in here No, they didn't want it for the CPI. They wanted it for the change in the number of meals being served. That supposedly because there was some variation in the number of meals being served, the vendor submitted a higher bill for the meals. And the agency in question just accepted the invoice from the vendor that they were entitled to an adjustment because of this variation in the number of meals. And we looked at the contract and we said the contract has a CPI adjustment factor, but nothing in there relative to a change in the number of meals being served. So the answer is no. The vendor is not entitled to an adjustment for the circumstance in which you submitted it. And aside from us saying no, it's like, and why are we the ones that have to say no? Don't you know what's in your own contract and what is permissible to pay and not permissible? Because if this would have been a lot less money, like under $25,000 or something like that, it could have happened and it never come to us. So it's important that these things be checked.
So they didn't have really a number of meals in the order, because I would have thought.
They had an estimate of how many meals would be served,
Okay.
and they had a price per meal. But the vendor submitted something that said there was, and I believe it was a decrease in the number of meals. They wanted to get an increase in the price per meal, and I don't know whether it was to get back to the same amount or what they intended to do, but they were using the decrease in the number of meals as a justification for the increase in the price per meal. Nothing in the contract said that that was an appropriate adjustment. If there's a CPI increase, once a year you can get the CPI increase to apply to the next year. Nothing about you did serve X thousand and now you serve X thousand minus 100. That was not an adjustment factor. And the agency just took the vendor's word, got the bill, submitted it for approval because it was more than $50,000, and we didn't approve it because it ain't in the contract. Can't do it. That is that constitutional prohibition about giving a vendor more money without more deliverables, not in the contract. Otherwise, we are violating, what was it, Section 35 of the Maryland Constitution about you can't pay more money for an in-place contract without more deliverables. So the answer was no. So this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to check these things. Is it appropriate to have an adjustment at all? And if it is, are the numbers right? And although it isn't that frequent that we get that it isn't appropriate, it is a little more frequent that you just can't do the math. And doing the math is also appropriate. Occasionally, the adjustment factor identified in a contract is discontinued or changed, and I have had this happen. So you say in the contract it will be the producer price index for a given commodity. And then 3 years into a 5-year contract, the producer price index changes and that commodity no longer exists. So now what is your adjustment factor? It was all nice and tidy and everything until the U.S. Bureau of Labor changed the rules. So what we typically do is we typically do two things. One of the things is the two parties could negotiate an acceptable substitute for the factor that can no longer be used. But the agency should not allow this circumstance to unreasonably benefit the contractor. The adjustment factor no longer exists. We have to kind of figure out now what is an appropriate substitute. And as long as you can come to mutual agreement, and from the standpoint of the agency, you're not unjustly enriching the vendor, that might be okay. Now, this requires a contract modification because it is a change to the contract. And you have to be able to try to estimate some dollar impact to determine what type of approval is necessary for that modification. But that is one option. If mutual agreement on a substitute cannot be obtained, the agency should dictate the new mechanism via a change order, which could result in a change in the contractor. So that's another illustration of change order. They want it to be one of a different producer price component, one that has coincidentally gone up a lot higher than average. We don't want that. They don't want to agree to what we want. It gets to the point we either say, well, you accept this or nothing, and we tell them this will be it, and they can file a claim if they think they want and deserve more money. And I want to say something else, but I'll see if it's on another slide. Okay, I think I'm going there. If the original contract does not contain a price adjustment provision, the contract usually should not be modified. Oh, all right. This is a different thought. Let me say one other thing. Usually, on the subject of adjustment mechanisms, there should be a clause that says in the event that mutual agreement cannot be obtained for a substitute for the indice that was eliminated, then the decision of the agency as to the appropriate adjustment is what will prevail. So you should always have the default that in the event that we can't come to a meeting of the minds, we're going to tell you. Now, whether they file a claim and say that we picked the wrong one, they still can do that, may get to a claim, but we always have the ability, should have the ability to have the upper hand via that clause or via simply a change order. Now, I'm going to a slightly different tact, and that is I have actually seen circumstances where, kind of like the situation that I just talked about, where an agency submitted a price adjustment when there was nothing in the contract that allowed a price adjustment. Well, can we modify the contract now to allow a price adjustment? And the first reaction is, why would we do that? The only reason we would do that is if we thought the prices were going to go down, or were at least just as likely to go down as to go up. If we do not have the conviction that the prices are going to either go down, or at least this be a neutral type of situation, so that it's more than likely the vendor's going to end up getting more money because of this modification, the same prohibition applies. Can't do it because it would be giving them more money without doing more work. So, I've only seen this a couple times, but the answer is no. Can't do it. And if it's likely that the adjustment's going to be down, no vendor's going to want to do it. And so they're only going to want it for the upside, and if it seems like it's going to give them more money, can't do it. All right.
Question.
Yes.
On contracts for multiple years, should we, as a normal rule, and this is to Gary, include a CPI factor?
I wouldn't normally do that.
You wouldn't?
I mean, if you're talking about 3 years, no, I wouldn't.
I'm looking at our elevator contract and our generator, preventive maintenance contract. That'll go for 3 years. And I was just worried that two years into it, all of a sudden things are happening that are really harmful to the vendor. Because
we can't accurately budget for that.
Yeah. Okay, it just sounded logical, because on the MAT contract that we had, one of the vendors was asking whether or not we would allow CPI to be in it, and we're getting to go out for 3 years on that.
We can discuss it offline, but just to mention CPI, there are...
Does everyone know what CPI is, Consumer Price Index?
Price index. What you might not know is that there's probably 100 different CPIs, and depending upon which one you choose, will greatly influence your percentage increase or decrease. Again, when I would do union contracts, they would always pick the CPI that historically produced the largest increase,
Right.
and we would talk about that.
Yeah,
So there are significant differences.
CPI is done both regionally, like we fall under the Washington, Baltimore, something metropolitan, and then you have the all prices CPI, and there are various component prices, such as when we do medical contracts, the tie-in is not to the entire CPI, it's the medical component of the CPI, which is always higher than the CPI itself. So that's an illustration. If you're doing producer price index, there's one specifically for fuel. Fuel is going to be more volatile than most other things on the producer price index. So the main thing is you got to nail down what indice you're talking about and what location and what component and things of this nature. All right. How many slides do I have on this?
You don't have any more to go.
What was that?
You don't have any more to go on this.
I know, I'm on to differing site conditions. 5 on differing site conditions, 1 a minute. Okay, here I go. Differing site conditions. We're talking about price adjustments. So we're talking about price adjustments when there's a built-in mechanism for adjusting prices after a contract has been awarded. Now we're going to a different type of price adjustments, and that's what's called differing site conditions. This is a circumstance that applies only to fixed price contracts. So if you're paying for what's called indefinite quantity contracts by a fixed unit price, where the vendor gets paid for however many number of units it provides, this does not come into play. But if they've given you a fixed price with estimated quantities, then this does come into play. So let's see, there can be a provision in fixed price contracts for an equitable adjustment. Equitable adjustment means we can pay them more money, or sometimes it means we can pay them less money, because equitable adjustment can go up or down. In the contractor's price for differing site conditions, this provision is most typical in construction contracts, but it might also be appropriate for certain non-construction contracts. And actually, this is different than what I just started to go down. So forget what I said a minute ago. We're on to fixed price for differing site conditions. For certain types of construction contracts, neither the state nor the vendors may be able to assess exactly what conditions will be encountered until the construction begins, and I'll give you a couple examples. If you're doing excavation work, the time, effort, and expense is very dependent on whether the area to be excavated is exclusively or predominantly sand, shale, sandstone, granite, something of that nature. What are you going to dig into? You can do a whole lot more excavating in soft sand than you can in granite. For many types of construction, the level of required work depends on the accuracy of blueprints, plans, etc. from years ago. And you have blueprints that say one thing is there, and the vendor gives you a price to do something, and then when they start doing it, they find what was on the blueprint isn't what they're encountering. That's a different site condition, differing site condition. The accuracy of old blueprints and plans, etc. Example, where buried water or sewer lines, electric or telephone cables, etc. are or are not. If the vendor is pricing to install a new water line to run off an existing water main that is supposed to be in a given location, but upon excavation the main line isn't where the map shows it, then what does the vendor do? The map showed that if I dig here and dig down X feet, I will find the main water line, and I know I'm going to tap into that and run a line from there to somewhere else. I dig down, it isn't there. Now, I've included in my price to dig here to this depth. Now, what do I start doing? Go 5 feet away, 10 feet away, 20 feet away? What do I do? Because the more time I'm on the job, with people out there, with equipment out there, I'm incurring more cost. And it isn't because I'm doing something different. It's because following the state's dictates, I'm not finding what the state told me was there. So that's when you work with the contract manager to, all right, what do I do now? Do I abandon it? Do I start going, do they look for better blueprints? Do I start digging very gingerly in 10-foot intervals all around the place until I hit something and hopefully don't hit it hard enough to puncture it? What do I do? Or if maps show no utilities, and this is what frequently happens where all of a sudden the lights go out. A map shows no utilities where new electric lines are to be buried, but an unmarked natural gas line is cut because it's not supposed to be there, but we start digging, and lo and behold, we pull up this line and this gas starts coming out and stuff like that. What do we do? Does it damage my equipment? Does it catch on fire? That's something that's not the vendor's fault. Other circumstances, if a building is to be renovated and it is expected that new floors can be placed over existing subflooring, but when the top layer of flooring is removed, the floor supports below are highly rotted and unable to sustain the added weight. how do I go ahead and do what I was supposed to do when if I do it, it's just going to cause the thing to collapse? And in non-construction contracts, it is possible that analogous circumstances may occur. Example, IT systems in particular. When working with a legacy software program, a vendor may find that what is actually in place is not what the records indicate. The software program, the code supposedly is such and such, but when they go into something, they find something completely different than what they're supposedly going to find from the code. What do? Because at that point, what they quoted a fixed price to do is no longer valid. In all these circumstances, the vendor's original fixed price likely won't cover the expense of what is encountered on the job, so to avoid the prospect that no vendor will bid on such work, that's always the one thing, because you have risk here of finding a different site condition. The one risk is that because of that, one possibility is because of that risk, no one will bid. Or the second possibility is if they have to cover any and all risks, they're going to bid through the ceiling, so that they're expecting they're going to have to dig 20 different places to find it. And neither one of those is a good outcome for the state. So a differing site conditions clause is added that allows the contractor's fixed price to be adjusted if conditions encountered are different than as described or predicted by the state, and the vendor, and this other one is crucial, and the vendor incurs more expense because of this. So the vendor's incurring more costs, not because of any action or inaction of their own, but because of inaccuracy or circumstances that weren't anticipated. So I'll do one more and then we'll take a break. To be entitled to an equitable price adjustment, the conditions encountered by a vendor must be different from what the state predicted or asserted, cause the vendor to incur added expenses. The adjustment must be commensurate with the added expense incurred. A vendor can file a claim if it isn't offered an equitable adjustment or isn't satisfied with the amount offered. Note, if a vendor encounters easier conditions than anticipated, the state does not enjoy a reduction in the contract cost under this differing site condition clause. It's one-sided only for a vendor to get more money. So, price adjustments. Take 15 minutes and we'll come back at 2:45.